Good morning. We are very glad to have all of you with us this morning. I know we have a number of guests, and we welcome you here. And for those of you who are with us online, we're very grateful that you're part of our family as well. We're taking a few weeks on Sunday mornings at the beginning of the year to walk through some texts early in the ministry and life of Jesus and considering how they inform the way that we move through this new year. These texts are also being explored in children's church, by the children's Bible class on Sunday mornings and the children's teen class on Sunday mornings. So it's an opportunity for all of us to be in the same set of texts each week. Wholly uninformed by anything Christian, when I was young, becoming an adult really revolved around these three things: driving, drinking, and voting. Really, to become an adult in my world as a young person meant that you could finally drive, you could finally choose to drink alcohol, and you could vote. Now, what meant the most to me as a young person was driving. That may not be surprising, but I did live in a very small town at the top of a very tall mountain. The town was called Cloudcroft, and the only way that you could do anything like getting some groceries, eating some fast food, going to see a movie, buying some clothes, was to drive out of Cloudcroft down the mountain to Alamogordo, the nearest town that had those resources at it. So driving wasn't just something we did for fun. Driving felt like it was absolutely essential if you wanted to do anything that normal teenagers would do. When I was young and learning to drive, our school still offered driver's education. You could take a driver's ed course during the school session during the day. And Coach Musgrove was the one who taught driver's ed when I was a teenager. Coach Musgrove coached basketball, volleyball, and basketball. And then he also risked his life teaching driver's ed. Because teaching driver's ed in Cloudcroft was no small feat. All the lanes, all the roads were these narrow two-lane roads that went throughout the mountains. Most of them had very sharp drop-offs on one side or the other, and it wasn't unusual for large logging trucks to come barreling down the road in the opposite direction. So one miscalculation, one distraction, one indecision, and your car would careen off the side to certain death or straight into the path of an oncoming logging truck. So teaching driver's ed was no small feat. And at least for a season, every week, Coach Musgrove risked his life doing that. I remember my first time behind the wheel with Coach Musgrove. There were three of us taking the class together. I was in the driver's seat. It was winter. We had just had snow and ice covered all of those roads. And Coach Musgrove wanted to drive down to Alamogordo. But first he wanted to stop by his house to pick up something that he needed for the trip. Coach Musgrove lived at the bottom of a very steep hill that was on the way to the narrow two-lane road that led all the way down to Alamogordo. So I cautiously pulled out of the school parking lot, driving 4 miles an hour, and inched our way down Burrow Street until we finally got to the crest of the hill on which Coach Musgrove lived. And I just slowed to a stop. And I could see that dirt road now was filled with snow. It was filled with ice. This was one of my very first times driving. And Coach Musgrove looked over and he said, "Let's go, Altrock." And so I gingerly pulled over the crest of that hill, and sure enough, we started to slide. The car turned sideways. I was pumping the brakes with nothing happening, and I could tell that we were going to slam into this large pile of snow left from when the snowplow had driven all the snow out of Coach Musgrove's driveway. And sure enough, we did. Bam! The car came to an abrupt stop. And without blinking an eye, Coach Musgrove got out of the car, stepped into his house, got whatever it was that he needed for our trip to Alamogordo, and got back in. let's go, Altrock. And so after much difficulty, I managed to extricate the car from the pile of snow and get back down that steep hill until we got to the 2-lane road. I was certain that we were all going to die. And that was one of the ways that I became an adult. Now, these milestones for becoming adults may have been different where you live. There are different milestones in every culture around the world. There's these rites of passage, these ways in which people take their steps toward adulthood. And that is exactly what we find happening in our text this morning. That's why Joseph and Mary and Jesus are in Jerusalem. Now, Luke tells us that every year Joseph and Mary would make this trip to Jerusalem for Passover. But this is a special year and a special trip because Jesus is 12. And when your child was 12 or 13, this was the time when you would especially want to make the trip to Jerusalem for Passover. It was a rite of passage into adulthood. It was one of the first steps, formal steps into the Jewish faith. And that's what's taking place in our text this morning. And so the text is about Joseph teaching Jesus what it means to be an adult. But it quickly turns into Jesus teaching them and us what it really means to be an adult. By law, Jewish men especially were required to make this pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so every year, some 60,000 to 100,000 visitors would pack the city of Jerusalem for Passover, a city that might have normally had some 25,000 people in it. And families would travel in these large groups during that pilgrimage to reach the city. That's how Joseph and Mary and Jesus have come to Jerusalem. It's time for Jesus to become an adult, to at least take his first steps toward adulthood. And there's a lot in this text that we could sort of explore around what it means to be an adult, what it means to grow up, and I just want to look at one of these. For Jesus, becoming an adult means being willing to change your spiritual address. Becoming an adult means being willing to change your spiritual address. So Joseph and Mary and their family have traveled to Jerusalem in very likely a large group of people. Passover's completed. They're now traveling back in that same large group of people. And so it's not a big deal that neither one of them happens to see 12-year-old Jesus as they begin traveling back. Surely he's with Uncle Bob or Aunt Mary's, with some other family member. But by the end of that first day of traveling away from Jerusalem, and they still don't see him, that's when the panic really sets in. And so the next day, they have to travel all the way back to Jerusalem. And then the next day, they have to spend that day searching frantically throughout the city. You can imagine the stress of that situation. And finally, there's 12-year-old Jesus at the temple. Listen again to Luke's account. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. It's probably a light translation there. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously looking for you." He said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" I think most of us can connect with this exchange, either as a child or as a parent. And I think most of us probably have some empathy for the frustration that Mary must feel, especially when she says, "Why have you treated us like this?" Apparently, raising 12-year-old Jesus was not much different than raising any other 12-year-old. But notice Jesus' response. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" Of course, he means this literally. He is literally in his Father's house. He's in the temple in Jerusalem. But more, he means this metaphorically. To be in someone's house in that time, as in this time, means to be under someone's authority. This is what frustrated parents mean when they say to a child, as long as you're living in my house, as long as you're eating at my table, as long as you're sleeping under my roof, what? You're going to do what I say. To be in someone's house means to live under their authority. And that's exactly what Jesus is saying here. This isn't about a field trip to the temple. This is about a change in spiritual address. What Jesus is making clear here, frustratingly clear here to his parents, is that from this point on, his family of origin, his hometown, their local synagogue, will no longer be the determiners of what he believes and how he lives. From this point on, God, the Father, will be. He is changing his spiritual address. Now, remember, at the end of this text, he goes back to Nazareth. He lives many more years in Nazareth. He's not moving out of the house. He's not moving to Capernaum, where he will end up. He's changing his spiritual address. From this point forward, his family of origin, his home community, his local community of faith will no longer be the arbiters of what he believes and how he lives. God, the Father, will be. He's changing his spiritual address. Now, doing this, especially at age 12, requires enormous courage and great risk. Clearly, mom and dad don't understand what's going on here. They're frustrated at this change. It won't be much longer before Jesus launches his public ministry, and eventually his own brothers will come after him, thinking that he's out of his mind for believing these things and living in this way. Many others will as well. And some will be so upset with a decision like this that they will murder him. This is the decision that eventually leads straight to the cross. But for Jesus, this is what it means to grow up. This is what it means to be an adult. It means changing your spiritual address. And so the text is inviting us to consider what that might look like in our own lives. That if we really want to grow up, if we really want to be mature, we too may need to change spiritual addresses. And for us, this may happen more than once. Now, changing a spiritual address, the first step is really acknowledging where we currently live. You know, every time I pick up a prescription at Walgreens, and the older I get, the more prescriptions I'm picking up at Walgreens. But every time I go in, the person behind the counter asks me, would you confirm your home address for me, please? And without even thinking, I say 1266 High Ridge Road. I know exactly where I live. But do you know where you live spiritually? What is your current spiritual address? Because for some of us, our spiritual address is still our family of origin or our home of origin. That's true for some of us because that's where we're still living. We're still literally under that roof. But it's true for others of us because metaphorically that's where we're still living. Mom and dad or some childhood experience really still governs much of what we believe about God and Christ and the Spirit and how we live out those beliefs. And some of that can be very healthy, but some of it can be very restricting and limiting as well. For some of us, our spiritual address is a community or a culture. Most of us have our Nazareth, a community, a culture that had a significant influence on what we believe about Father, Son, and Spirit, and how we live out those beliefs. If you spend any time in the South, you know that's a strong culture, spiritually speaking, that can shape those beliefs and lives. Moving as a newcomer to the Northeast, I recognize there's a culture here that shapes what people believe and how they live out those beliefs. As Americans, we live in a country that shapes significantly what we believe about God, how we read Scripture, how we live our lives. Some of that can be very healthy, and some of that can be toxic. And for some of us, our spiritual address really is a church or a denomination. Churches and denominations have a huge influence on what we believe and how we live out those beliefs. And that's especially true in our digital culture. Most of us, just through our phones, now have access to sermons and worship services and podcasts and books from faith communities and faith leaders all over the world. And that can really be expansive, that can be enlightening, but it can also be limiting and restricting. Now, some of us probably have more than one spiritual address. For some of us, some of the things that we believe about these issues come from our family of origin. Some of the things that we live out come from this culture. And some of the things that are important to us in terms of the center of our spiritual life come from a church or a denomination. Whereas others of us really do have one primary spiritual address. There's one place or person or community or season in our life that most fully formed, even today, what we believe and how we live out those beliefs. But what Jesus is teaching by example here is that to grow up, to be mature, to be an adult, means making the hard decision to change from those spiritual addresses to making God, the Father, our primary spiritual address. And that can be a very difficult thing to do. It's hard to change addresses. It's hard to change literal addresses. 2 years ago, Kendra and I changed physical addresses. We left an address on a street in Memphis, Tennessee. We moved to a new address on a street here in Stamford. And that meant packing up countless boxes, interviewing and hiring a moving company, driving halfway across the country, moving into a space we'd never lived in, with people we'd not really spent much time with. Changing physical addresses is difficult. Changing spiritual addresses is all the more difficult. And yet, if we want to be mature, if we want to grow up in 2023, for many of us, that's exactly the kind of move that we have to make. It was one of the first moves that I had to make in my own spiritual journey. I grew up in a church, in a family that had no space for church, no religious conversations, no Christian faith at all. And so when my brother and I began attending church as sophomores in high school, that was a radical shift for us. And in many ways, we were changing spiritual addresses. We were saying what we gained from our family of origin, our home of origin, is no longer sufficient for us. And we're going to move out now. Not literally, we stayed in that house till we graduated from high school, but spiritually, we moved out of our house when we were sophomores in high school because we believed God, the Father, was calling us to do that. Now, sometimes this is called deconstruction and reconstruction. But I think maybe this image of changing addresses may be a little more helpful. I think of our friend Amy who visited us just before Christmas. Amy grew up in a fairly fundamentalist church. And over the years, we've known her to change her perspective on everything from images of God to the roles of men and women in the kingdom of God, to people that are in or out of the kingdom of God. And Each of those times, they've led to robust conversations with family members or church members. But over those years, she's been willing to take those risks and to show that courage. Because in the end, living in the Father's house was worth it. Living in the Father's house was really the best place to live. And I want to encourage you, as you think about 2023, I want to encourage you to consider ways in which God may be inviting you to leave a specific spiritual address for the Father's house. I don't know what that issue may be, that topic might be, but over this year, I want to invite you to consider in what ways is God inviting you to come yet one more time into the Father's house. Because the Father's house is the best place to live. We hear these words at the end of David's shepherding psalm, Psalm 23, when David says, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long." What a great resolution at the beginning of the year. I shall dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long. David says this in Psalm 27, "One thing I asked of the Lord, this I seek, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." David means this literally, but think of these words metaphorically. What if this was our prayer for 2023? The one thing that we ask of the Lord, to live in the house of the Lord. Psalm 92 says, "The righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God." What would it look like for you to be planted in the Father's house in every aspect of your life? And then Psalm 122, "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord.'" I was glad. And if we go anywhere in 2023, let's go to the house